Imagine this. You're a decorated soldier, finally heading home after serving your country. And the moment you sit down in first class, a man demands you move because, in his words, you don't belong there. What happened next left the entire plane speechless, and it's a moment you'll never forget. "Get out of my seat." The sharp words sliced through the quiet cabin like a blade. Conversations hushed. Pages of magazines froze mid-turn. Coffee cups paused in midair. Every passenger within earshot turned to see where the hostility was coming from. In the aisle, blocking the flow of boarding passengers, stood a tall man in a pressed gray suit. His polished shoes gleamed under the soft cabin lights, and his silver wristwatch flashed as he pointed an accusing finger. His voice carried not only authority but also disdain. He was staring down at a young woman seated comfortably in first class. She was calm, almost serene, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She wasn't dressed in business attire like the rest of the first-class passengers. Instead, she wore a crisp U.S. Army uniform. The rows of ribbons on her chest glinted faintly under the cabin lights, telling silent stories of sacrifice and service. Her name tag read Williams. Sergeant Maya Williams. She had just returned from an exhausting deployment overseas, her mind and body aching for rest. The flight was supposed to be a small reprieve, a few hours of peace before she finally reunited with her family waiting at home. She wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't looking for recognition. She simply wanted quiet. But the man in the suit wasn't about to give her that. "That's my seat," he snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. His lips curled into a smirk as he pointed down the aisle. "You must be lost. Coach is that way." A hush fell across the cabin. The passengers, now invested in the unfolding scene, whispered among themselves. A woman clutched her purse closer. A teenager tilted his phone, slyly hitting record. Even the sound of the boarding announcements seemed to fade as tension spread like wildfire. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She looked up, her voice steady but firm, every syllable laced with the calm authority of someone who had faced far greater danger than an arrogant man in a suit. "Sir," she said evenly, "this is 4A. That's what's on my ticket." For a heartbeat, the man blinked at her, as if stunned she had dared to speak back. Then a scoff burst from his lips, followed by a bitter laugh. "Yeah, no. I paid for this seat. There's no way the airline put you here. Look at you, uniform or not, you don't belong in first class. So move before I call the attendant." His voice was louder now, harsh, and it reverberated through the cabin. Gasps echoed from a few rows back. A mother leaned in close to her teenage daughter, whispering, "Can you believe this?" A businessman in row 3 shook his head, muttering under his breath. Phones were lifted higher as more passengers pressed record, eager to capture the confrontation. The man folded his arms, puffing out his chest as if this display of arrogance somehow made him superior. His smug grin suggested he believed victory was already his, that the woman in uniform would give in and retreat down the aisle in shame. But Sergeant Maya Williams was no stranger to intimidation. She had stared down enemies in war zones, walked through the ruins of villages, and carried wounded comrades under gunfire. She had faced fear in its rawest form. And now, here in the comfort of an airplane cabin, she was facing a different kind of battle, one of prejudice, disrespect, and ignorance. Maya took a slow breath, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. Around her, the atmosphere thickened, heavy with unspoken questions. Would she argue? Would she get up? Would this turn into a shouting match? Instead, she simply met the man's eyes with a calm that rattled him more than anger ever could. "No, sir," she said quietly, but with a firmness that carried through the cabin. "I'm exactly where I belong." The man's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The audience, because by now, the passengers were no longer just bystanders but witnesses to a drama, held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Phones kept rolling. Hearts pounded. Every second stretched longer than the last. And in that moment, the airplane cabin felt less like a place of travel and more like a stage, where dignity and arrogance were about to collide, and only one would walk away unbroken. The flight attendant, a young woman with neat blonde hair tucked under her cap, hurried down the aisle. Her name tag read Claire. She forced a polite smile, though the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation in first class before the plane even left the ground. "Is there a problem here?" Claire asked gently, her voice carrying the kind of trained calmness flight attendants are taught to use in stressful situations. "Yes, there's a problem," the man in the gray suit boomed, his voice louder than necessary. He jabbed his finger toward Maya as though pointing at an intruder. "This soldier, or whatever she is sitting in my seat. I paid for first class. I didn't pay all this money to sit in economy, so she needs to move." The passengers who had been whispering before now sat frozen in silence. The only sounds were the shuffle of boarding passengers further back and the low hum of the air conditioning above their heads. Phones continued recording, the little red dots of "wreck" glowing in the hands of several onlookers. Claire, still calm, extended her hand. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" With a dramatic sigh, the man shoved the printed stub into her hand. His smug expression returned as though this small piece of paper was his ultimate weapon, proof that he had been wronged. Claire studied it carefully, then checked Maya's. She leaned down with an apologetic smile at the soldier. "Ma'am, your ticket is correct. 4A is your seat." Maya gave a polite nod but said nothing, her face unreadable. Claire then straightened and turned to the man. "Sir, your seat is actually 4B. That's the one right next to hers." She gestured to the empty seat beside Maya. For a brief moment, the man's smugness faltered. His eyes flicked from the ticket to the seat, and then back to Claire, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. A faint murmur rose from the nearby passengers, some chuckling under their breath. But then, the man's face darkened, turning crimson with anger. "You expect me to sit next to her?" he barked. "No way. Absolutely not. I don't fly next to people like her." The words spilled out of him coated in venom. They were not just rude, they were heavy, ugly, dripping with prejudice. The kind of words that made the cabin temperature feel like it dropped 10 degrees. "I won't sit there. I paid for comfort, not to be shoved next to someone like that." Maya had not moved during the entire exchange. She sat with her back straight, hands folded calmly on her lap. Her face betrayed almost nothing, but her jawline was rigid, her composure clinging to discipline. Inside, though, there was a sting that burned sharper than she wanted to admit. She had endured insults before, even in her own country while wearing the uniform she was so proud of. But it never got easier. She had spent years serving overseas, watching friends risk their lives, writing letters to families who never got their loved ones back. She had stood in deserts with dust in her throat, and jungles with fear in her bones. She had done it all believing that, back home, people would understand what the uniform meant. And now here she was, being told she didn't deserve a seat she had rightfully earned. Not because of money. Not because of rules. But because of who she was. Maya drew in a slow breath, steadying her emotions like she had been trained to do under fire. She would not allow this man's arrogance to shake her resolve. The cabin was silent again. Dozens of eyes were on her, waiting to see if she would break her silence, if she would lash out, or if she would stand down. Phones hovered like vultures, ready to capture her every reaction. But Maya knew something the man didn't. Sometimes the loudest answer wasn't made with volume, but with dignity. And though his words had cut deep, her silence at that moment carried a strength he couldn't match. And that strength was beginning to turn the cabin against him. Before Claire could even form her next sentence, Maya raised her hand slightly, a silent signal that she wanted to speak. Her voice, when it came, was calm, eerily calm, almost too calm for the storm swirling around them. "Sir," she began, her tone steady but commanding, "I fought for your right to sit wherever you please on this flight." The words fell like a stone into still water. The cabin, which had been buzzing with whispers and shuffling, froze instantly. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was charged, thick, the kind of silence where every breath feels louder than it should. Passengers leaned in, eager not to miss a single word. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade, as if the aircraft itself wanted to listen. Maya's eyes never wavered from the man's face. "I've carried soldiers out of burning vehicles. I've slept in deserts where the sand was my bed, where the cold at night cut deeper than a knife. I've watched friends go into battle and not come back. And I've written letters no one ever wants to write, To families who lost someone they loved, someone who gave everything for this country. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't shout. But the weight in her words was heavier than any scream could have been. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions sobered. A woman in row 2 clasped her hands together, her eyes glassy. A businessman in the aisle seat lowered his phone, recording forgotten, and just listened. Maya drew in a slow breath and continued. And yet, here I am. Just wanting to sit quietly on a plane, to see my family, to breathe in a little peace. But you look at me, at this uniform, and decide I don't deserve to sit next to you. She paused. Her words hung in the air like heavy smoke, impossible to wave away. If you think this uniform makes me unworthy, she said, her voice tightening, then maybe it says more about you than it does about me. A collective shiver ran through the cabin. It was as if every passenger had been struck by the same realization at once. The man in the gray suit, who had moments earlier been puffed up with arrogance, now looked utterly deflated. His mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish gasping for air. The sharp retort he had prepared seemed to die in his throat. He had expected her to shout, to fight, to cause a scene he could twist into his advantage. Instead, she had given him the one thing he wasn't prepared for, dignity. Calm, unwavering dignity that turned his cruelty into something small and pitiful. Maya's gaze remained locked on him, steady as stone. And though she wasn't smiling, there was a quiet strength in her expression, the kind of strength that comes from battles already fought and scars already earned. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of her truth. It was filled with the shame pressing down on the man who had tried to humiliate her. A passenger in the back whispered, almost reverently, "Wow," another muttered. She shut him down without even raising her voice. Even Claire, the flight attendant, stood frozen, her lips parted in awe. She had witnessed countless arguments in her career, but never had she seen one diffused with such quiet, devastating power. Finally, Maya lowered her gaze to her lap, signaling she was done speaking. She didn't need to say another word. Her message had landed with surgical precision. The man, for once, had no response. His lips trembled slightly, his face flushed a deep red, but no sound came. He slumped back, retreating into silence, while the soldier he had tried to belittle sat unshaken, calm, composed, and undeniably dignified. And in that moment, every passenger knew exactly who the stronger person in that cabin was. For then, something remarkable happened, something that shifted the entire mood of the cabin. Who rose back? A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and travel-worn clothes slowly rose to her feet. She clutched the armrest for balance, but her voice, when it rang out, carried with surprising strength. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm in economy, but I'd gladly give up my seat if it means this soldier gets to sit in peace without being harassed." Her words rippled through the cabin like a spark hitting dry grass. Heads turned, whispers became exclamations, and then, almost immediately, another voice joined in. "Me too," a man in business attire called out from across the aisle. He raised his hand firmly. "She deserves better treatment than this nonsense." And then another. "I'd switch in a heartbeat." One by one, voices rose in solidarity. It wasn't just polite agreement, it was a swell, a rising tide of support that echoed through the plane. The tension that had once been heavy with hostility was now charged with something else entirely: unity. Hands began clapping. A few passengers whistled. Someone, overcome with admiration, even raised their hand in a makeshift salute toward Maya. Others nodded solemnly, their eyes shining with gratitude. The man in the gray suit, who had been so loud and brash moments earlier, suddenly looked very small. His arrogance faltered as he glanced around at the passengers glaring at him with thinly veiled disgust. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though the air had grown too hot to breathe. Claire, the flight attendant, tried to hide her smile but couldn't quite suppress it. She glanced down at Maya, her eyes soft with respect, clearly moved by the wave of support spreading through the cabin. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was hope in the air, not tension. And then, as if the scene hadn't already transformed into something extraordinary, the cockpit door opened with a firm click. The captain himself stepped into the cabin. He was a tall man, his uniform crisp, his hat tucked neatly under one arm. His presence alone commanded respect, and when he looked around the cabin, the noise fell into silence once again. The captain's gaze finally landed on Maya, and his expression softened with recognition and gratitude. "Sergeant Williams," he said clearly, his voice resonant enough to reach every corner of the plane, "on behalf of this airline, and on behalf of my crew, I want to personally thank you for your service." The passengers broke into applause again, louder this time, the kind that rattled the overhead bins. Some stood just to clap harder. Maya's eyes widened slightly at the sudden recognition, but she remained composed, her discipline intact. The captain, however, wasn't finished. His tone shifted slightly, becoming firmer as he turned his attention to the man in the gray suit. "And sir," he said, his voice cutting through the clapping like steel, "her seat is hers. She keeps it. If you don't like it," he paused, letting the silence sink in, "you're welcome to leave the plane." The words landed like a gavel hitting the bench of a courtroom. Final. Absolute. The man's face drained of color. His jaw opened in disbelief, but no words came. The glares of the passengers bore down on him like a spotlight. There was no sympathy here, no allies, no ground left for him to stand on. He had gone from self-proclaimed superior to isolated villain in the span of minutes. His eyes darted desperately around the cabin, searching for even a flicker of support. But what he found were folded arms, raised eyebrows, and the unwavering disapproval of every single person on board. And in that suffocating silence, his arrogance finally evaporated. Shoulders slumping, he lowered himself into his seat, his rightful seat, 4B, next to Maya. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He simply sat there, humiliated, drowning in the consequences of his own words. The cabin, meanwhile, erupted again, not in chaos, but in applause. This time it wasn't just for Maya. It was for dignity, for justice, for the simple truth that decency had triumphed over cruelty. And Maya, sitting quietly in 4A, allowed herself the smallest of breaths, relief mixed with pride. She hadn't asked for the spotlight. She hadn't wanted applause. All she had wanted was respect. And in that moment, respect had been restored, not just by her words, but by the unity of the strangers around her. 5 as the engines roared and the plane lifted gracefully into the sky, Maya leaned back against her seat and turned her gaze toward the oval window. The city below shrank into a patchwork of lights and roads, fading beneath the soft blanket of clouds. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the earlier confrontation pressing against her thoughts. Yet beneath that heaviness, she hadn't asked for applause. She hadn't asked for strangers to stand up for her, or for a captain to make a speech in her defense. All she had wanted was the simplest of things, to sit quietly, to be treated with the same respect she gave freely to others while wearing her uniform. That was all. But sometimes, the simplest wishes are the hardest to be granted. The man beside her, who only minutes before had been the loudest voice in the cabin, now sat stiff and silent. His gaze was fixed stubbornly forward, eyes refusing to meet hers, as though contact might burn him. He fiddled nervously with his watch, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and pulled at his tie, but never spoke a word. The arrogance that once dripped from him had dried up completely. Meanwhile, the other passengers had not forgotten. A steady stream of small gestures began flowing toward Maya throughout the flight. A woman leaned over just to whisper, "Thank you for your service." A young man, barely 20, gave her a respectful nod, his eyes shining with admiration. One passenger, a father traveling with his son, reached across the aisle to shake her hand, quietly telling his boy, "This is what a real hero looks like." Maya accepted each gesture humbly, her responses soft and brief. She wasn't seeking the spotlight. But in that moment, she understood something powerful. It wasn't her story alone anymore. It had become theirs, the passengers, the witnesses, the ones who had seen firsthand what grace under fire truly looked like. The hours passed quietly, the hum of the plane soothing, but as the wheels finally touched down and the plane rolled to a halt, tension once again flickered in the air. Not anger this time, but anticipation. Maya stood, reaching up to retrieve her bag from the overhead bin. Her movements were calm, deliberate. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the eyes of nearly every passenger on her. Some clapped again softly. Others smiled in encouragement. A few simply watched in silence, their respect clear in their gaze. And then she turned, not to the crowd, not to the flight attendant, but to the man who had doubted her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't spit venom. She didn't even glare. Instead, she looked at him with the same calm, steady eyes she had used when she faced him the first time. "Next time you see someone in uniform," she said quietly, "remember this: we don't wear it for ourselves. We wear it for you, even if you can't see the value in it." Her words were soft, but in the silence of the cabin, they rang like a bell. The man's face collapsed into shame, his eyes finally falling to the floor. He had nothing left to say. And with that, Maya turned, her step steady, her head held high. She walked off the plane with the grace of someone who had already won, not through anger or vengeance, but through quiet dignity. Behind her, passengers exchanged looks, inspired. Some felt tears prick their eyes. Others felt their hearts swell. All of them knew they had witnessed something they would never forget, not just a soldier's strength, but a human being's unwavering grace. Within hours, the story spread online. Clips from the passengers' phones flooded social media, viewed millions of times. Headlines didn't focus on the arrogance of the man, but on the composure of Sergeant Maya Williams, the soldier who stood tall without ever raising her voice. And as people across the world watched, one truth became undeniable. Real power isn't always shown in anger or in force. Sometimes, the strongest statement is silence. Sometimes, the most devastating blow is dignity. Moral of the story: respect is not about where someone sits, it's about who they are and what they stand for. And sometimes, the quietest response leaves the loudest impact. And that's the end of today's story. If you were inspired by Sergeant Maya's strength and dignity, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.